incident. This is a look at the scene. Demonstrators smashed windows and stole items from businesses as fires burn in the downtown area. The police department tweeted early this morning that the officers were taken to a hospital with injuries that were not believed to be life-threatening. It was unclear who fired the shots. Police Chief John Hayden had this strong message for the violence.
So some coward fired shots at officers. And now we have 4 in the hospital. But thankfully, and thank God, they're alive. They're alive. But can we make some sense out of this? Can we make some sense out of this? That's all I'm trying to say.
All right, a lot of emotion there. Let's go ahead and bring in Chris Regner from St. Louis. Is Chris there? All right, there we go. Thanks, Chris, for joining us this morning.
How are you?
Good, good. Thanks for joining us. So, what can you tell us about the condition of those officers, and do we know anything about the suspects and why they started shooting?
Actually, the suspect information still unclear, under investigation at this hour. The good news here is that those 4 officers who were shot are all expected to survive. As you were saying earlier, this all went down when what were non-violent protests took a violent turn late last night. This was about midnight, not far from police headquarters in the downtown area of St. Louis. Those officers, according to Police Chief John Hayden, who you just heard from, were basically in an area like a line of police officers who were in that downtown area when these shots just rang out. Chief Hayden saying early this morning that it is the belief, at least initially, that whoever fired these shots was basically firing randomly into this line of police and hit those 4 officers. In terms of injuries, 2 of the officers, we understand, were shot in the leg. 1 was hit in the foot. The other was hit in the arm. Good news, actually, again, none of those injuries considered non-life threatening. But I've personally known Chief Hayden, who you just heard from there, for many years, 20 years or so now. That was strong language coming from him. He is usually not quite that emotional, but clearly you can hear from those comments he was frustrated, he was upset, and really just looking to make some kind of sense out of a seemingly senseless situation, at least in the sense that these officers were just downtown doing their job, and all of a sudden these random shots ring out and they're winding up being rushed to the hospital.
Yeah, I can only imagine. That's definitely a scary situation there. So what is the atmosphere there like today compared to last night?
I think after being here for Ferguson in the wake of Michael Brown several years ago, it's kind of the similar situation where people are trying to clean up. Today, the president of the board and aldermen here in St. Louis sent out a tweet earlier, a request for people to come help clean up these areas that were vandalized, looted last night. People are certainly on edge, certainly concerned, especially after what's happened here in the past with other situations of unrest. And you got to understand, too, that situation there with those 4 officers last night was one of several incidents throughout the city. There were multiple situations last night where fires broke out, businesses were looted. At this point, the St. Louis City Police Department still doesn't even have an official count of how many businesses were looted last night, and the fire department doesn't have an official count of how many fires were set. There was another situation, very tragic, last night where a pawn shop in town was looted, and there was a 77-year-old man who was shot and killed during that incident, and that man was just identified a short time ago by city police. Turns out he is a retired and well-known former St. Louis City Police Department captain who was with the department for many years. So another tragedy last night, and I think people here are just kind of bracing themselves for what might be coming, because unlike so many of these cities, actually, you simply don't know what's going to happen when the sun goes down. Most of these protests, we had big protests here yesterday during the day that were peaceful in the sense that there wasn't a lot of violence. They were shutting down streets and the like, but no gunshots. But then when the sun goes down, as you well know, these situations can sometimes take a turn for the worst.
Yeah, and it's definitely interesting that you mentioned the Mike Brown situation, because I know I've been seeing all these protests around the country, and it looks similar to what happened back then when the Mike Brown death happened as well. All right, well, thanks so much for joining us.
Indeed, several years ago, not far from where we are here, absolutely.
All right, well, thanks so much for joining us and giving some insight there in St. Louis. All right, let's move on now to Georgia, where Atlanta police have arrested more than 350 people since Friday. Last night, peaceful protesters marched from Atlanta City Hall and then ended up barricading them as some headed to the interstate. Archith Sedutri joined the protesters and was tapped in the middle of the commotion.
For the third night in a row, Atlanta will have another curfew at 9 p.m. to end some of the violence that's been taking place with the protests in downtown Atlanta. And during the day, it's a much different scene. We see people holding up signs, chanting, "Police the police," no justice, no peace, and also putting hands up, don't shoot. Protesters making their way all the way from City Hall down here on Memorial. There's a huge police presence.
They have us surrounded on all four sides. We can't leave. Now we're blocked off from everywhere. I don't know where we're supposed to go.
This is Aaron Romano's second peaceful protest since Friday.
They don't want us to move. They're telling us as soon as we hit the street, we'll be arrested. My friend was wrongfully arrested for no reason. He told us to get out of the street. We were moving out of the street, and for some reason, the officer decides to hit him, and now he's going to jail.
Romano says the police are escalating the violence.
They are inciting us to riot. They want us to riot. They want to get a reaction out of us.
Atlanta police arrested around 55 people Monday, some for blocking streets, others for marching towards the interstate.
There was no issue. He told us to get out of the street. We started moving out of the street. Now my friend is going to jail.
What started out as a peaceful protest in City Hall just a short while ago quickly escalated, with police blocking off many of the protesters who say they were out here peacefully marching. Now the police and the National Guard are walking through several streets in downtown Atlanta, right behind the Capitol, and we're seeing a noticeable shift, a difference in the way police are arresting many people. Those protesters simply asking the question, why?
I was walking across this crosswalk with everyone else, and I was arrested with everyone else for no reason.
It's injustice at its finest. They have so many cops. They have National Guard out here. And we don't have weapons. We don't have guns. We just have signs. We just have our voices.
This weekend, the city's police chief fired 2 Atlanta officers for using excessive force on 2 college students after they smashed their car windows and tased them.
Stand with us. They should be as outraged as we are. Stand with us.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in Archith from Atlanta, Georgia. And Archith, can you just give us a sense of, what the mood is like today versus yesterday?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think the mood really has been the same for the most part. I think the frustration really stems from why are these people being arrested? And being on the ground with them and sort of being barricaded ourselves, we sort of got to see that firsthand, what it was like. And we asked the police, we asked Atlanta police, what is the reason? Why are you arresting these people? What did they do wrong? We've emailed the police chief, we've reached out to city leaders, and we've not really gotten a proper response. All we've been told is more than 350 people arrested and about 55 yesterday. Some of these people were just crossing the street. And they got to a point right outside City Hall in the Capitol where police and the National Guard had blocked them in a square, and we were in that square, and they were asking the question that everybody was asking. How do you get out? You are blocking all of these people. What do you expect them to do? And for people simply crossing the street, you arrest them. Of course, people are going to get frustrated and escalate that violence. And in that video we just saw in my package, the report, we saw 2 Atlanta police officers using excessive force, using tasers. So there is a line. There is a line between using authority to curb and make sure that violence does not get out of control, than perhaps using it unnecessarily. Now, last night, right outside Centennial Park, we did see some of the officers kneel down right outside the CNN Center where things escalated Friday. So it's interesting to see that a lot of these protests are being peaceful. Some people say that some of the folks who are coming in and looting are out-of-towners, but the mayor says you can protest peacefully, but for the 3rd night in a row, another curfew. We don't know just yet if that's going to be extended or not.
Yeah, and so we know those 2 officers were fired for the incident a few days ago. Have you noticed a change at all in police since that situation happened?
I can talk about my experience and what we saw on the ground, and yesterday even being part of the media, right? We're having our tripod, our camera, trying to get to our car. Some of the police officers, naturally very defensive, were not being as supportive or as compassionate. I think the key word is empathy. You know, we had interviewed the governor. Our car was parked right outside the Capitol. I was just finishing up the report, trying to walk to my car, and the cops wouldn't let the media get through. In fact, they arrested an AJC reporter who was covering the protest just like all of us, or were journalists witnessing history. And it wasn't until members of the media had to step in and tell them, this is a journalist, this is freedom of the press. There is no reason for you to arrest this person. And on Sunday night, a very similar situation, a Washington Post reporter also arrested for not having their press badges. And we know we don't always carry our badges all the time, but obviously carrying a tripod or camera and recording this, that is a freedom of the press. Yeah. So it really was surprising. We certainly hope that law enforcement curbs violence and stops the bad guys, but doesn't stop the people like us telling those stories and making sure that everyone's voices are heard.
All right. Well, thank you so much for giving us that update, and stay safe out there. And President Donald Trump says he will mobilize the U.S. military to stop riots that have been sparked by the death of George Floyd. The president made the announcement from the Rose Garden as protesters gathered outside the White House ahead of curfew. He is recommending that governors across the country deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers to dominate the streets and contain violence, or he will deploy military troops.
Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
This is especially true in my home state of Kentucky. In mid-April, Kentucky's daily testing rate was below 20 per 100,000 residents. Thankfully, Kentucky has significantly increased its testing capacity over the last few weeks, and Kentucky has now exceeded the daily average amount of testing recommended by the White House. The federal government has made substantial efforts for states to increase testing capacity. Given the increased worldwide demand, there have been shortages of various components needed to collect samples and perform the tests, including swabs, transport media reagents, and personal protective equipment. I appreciate how rapidly the federal government, the states, and the private sector have acted to help address these supply issues. For example, through Laboratory Diagnostic Testing Task Force, the federal government and industry have developed a better understanding of challenges in the supply chain and expected inventory, and HHS and FEMA have worked diligently to address these issues, including by obtaining swabs and viral transport media for
that he thinks need it.
All right. And so what are you hearing from members of Congress about the president's decision to mobilize troops on U.S. soil?
So this is where you are continuing to see a partisan divide as well. Tom Cotton is, of course, a Republican, and you're hearing the same thing from his colleagues in the House and Senate as well, for the most part, that, this violence cannot continue, and it needs to be dealt with quickly, swiftly, and in kind of a, a powerful manner, whereas you have Democrats on the other side saying that, this really would kind of send the wrong message, to send in even our military domestically to try to take care of what has mostly been peaceful protests that have turned violent, as we've seen a little bit later on.
Yeah, I know as a military brat, it's something that I've never seen before, being deployed here in the U.S. So you're there in Washington. Can you just tell us a little bit about what the atmosphere is like there today?
Sure. From the looks of it, we haven't been getting too close to it at night since we don't have a security team to help us like some of the networks do. And so we've been kind of seeing just the aftermath throughout the day. And today it does seem to have quieted down. Even walking around my neighborhood, you still see, graffiti in places and some store windows busted out, but people are still kind of just doing what they have been for the past couple of days, continuing to clean up and then being very peaceful throughout the day.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning, Jesse.
Of course.
All right, hundreds joined forces for a peaceful protest at the Tennessee state capitol. The crowd sang hymns, chanted, and called for action against what they called unjust policing. Here's CB Cotton.
Peaceful protest started here in Legislative Plaza and ended on the steps of the Tennessee State Capitol with a powerful moment from the Tennessee National Guard. As the sun was setting on Capitol Hill, protesters arrived with intentions set on being peaceful.
You guys can change the narrative.
Their voices saying no to any type of rioting and yes to unity.
Now we have turmoil going on across our country.
Those gathered say the turmoil won't end until racism ends and new legislation protects against any unjust policing.
Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter!
Some here expressing their Christian faith, asking others of faith to join in.
We recognize that Jesus' death was both a sacrifice and a murder. And when you identify it as a murder, we have a responsibility to be out here demanding justice for acts of cruelty and acts of violence.
Singing hymnals and walking 2 by 2, some state representatives held up barrier tape, allowing protesters to pass through.
Let it shine, let it shine.
And once at the top,
I want to thank our National Guard for being on the right side of history.
The Tennessee National Guard dropping their shields, what some called a sunset on an act of faith.
As you know, I'm a minister, and to me it was a movement of faith to see them put down their swords and shields, because we came up here singing, we came up here prayerful.
At the state capitol, I'm CB Cotton, News 2.
All right, let's bring in Josh Breslow now from Nashville. And Josh, I have to say it's refreshing to see the peaceful protesting there. You know, we haven't seen that across the country. So just tell me a little bit about what the atmosphere is like right now in Nashville.
I mean, overall, it's fairly tense, just like it would be across the country. But like you said, that's what you want to see are those protests where everyone kind of joins in together and you don't have the violence, you don't have the looting afterward, anything like that. You have everyone kind of come together and be as one, law enforcement and demonstrators all there together. So that was refreshing to see.
Yeah, and so what do you think makes that protest there different from some of these other ones that we've seen that, you know, have transitioned into riots? Does that happen after nightfall there too as well?
Yes. Okay, well, so that one may have been a little different because it was a little bit earlier in the day, but also because we saw the destruction that happened all across Nashville on Saturday, and hopefully people realized the aftermath of that and how bad it can be. So they all came together and decided, look, let's have a peaceful rally and a peaceful protest. And law enforcement said, let's be a part of that as well. And that's what you saw there was everyone putting down their stuff and joining together.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell me a little bit about Saturday then? You said it was Saturday there was some destruction?
Yeah, so Saturday there was a lot of destruction. It's not what we were expecting, and the police department didn't expect it either. So they had some extra officers out during a rally, but afterward there was a police cruiser that was damaged, destroyed, and spray painted. Then you had a fire that was set first outside the courthouse and then inside of the courthouse, and then Broadway, obviously the most popular spot in Nashville. Windows were broken out of stores and a bunch of items were stolen. There were fires that were set inside businesses. It got way worse than anyone expected. So days later, you had this other protest and this other rally, and it was much, much more peaceful.
Yeah. Have there been any arrests from any of these protests there in Nashville?
So the Saturday incident had about 29 arrests so far. Most of them were for breaking curfew, but then there were a couple for someone who did set the courthouse on fire and then also someone who helped vandalize the courthouse. So it's likely that more arrests will be made, but most of them were actually simply for breaking the curfew that the mayor set for 10 p.m. that night.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Josh, and giving us that update. All right, well, that's all the time we have now. Thanks for joining us. We will be right back here tomorrow at 10:30 Central. Have a great time.